Have you ever looked into the eyes of the person you promised your life to, only to realize they brought you to a crowded ballroom for the sole purpose of utterly destroying you? My name is Genevieve. I spent 6 years breaking my back, working double shifts to put my husband, Philip, through his elite master's program, only for him to abandon me the second he tasted high society. Tonight he sent me a gold-embossed invitation to his massive promotion gala with a cruel note. Come see what you could never give me, and bring a pen for the divorce papers. He thought he held all the cards. He thought he was untouchable. But Philip didn't know that the royal guest of honor he was trying so desperately to impress was about to recognize the tarnished, broken locket resting against my collarbone. Buckle up, because karma doesn't just bite. Sometimes it arrives wearing a crown. The rain was lashing against the single, cracked window of my damp Brixton flat when the courier arrived. He looked entirely out of place, standing on my peeling linoleum landing, dressed in a sharp maroon uniform, holding an umbrella that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. The insignia stamped into the wax, a stylized C interwoven with an A, belonged to Croft & Associates, the premier diplomatic consulting and royal advisory firm in London. More importantly, it was the firm where my estranged husband, Philip Pendleton, had spent the last 2 years climbing the corporate ladder over the broken pieces of our marriage. My hands, still rough and slightly dusted with flour from my 4 a.m. shift at a local bakery, hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside was an invitation printed on heavy cardstock. Richard Croft cordially invites you to a gala celebrating the ascension of Philip Pendleton to senior partner. It was to be held at the Savoy Hotel this coming Saturday. But it wasn't the invitation that made my stomach drop. It was the handwritten note attached to the back with a silver paperclip. The handwriting was unmistakably Philip's, sharp, hurried, and aggressively angled. Jenny, the note read. Don't ignore this one. I'm making senior partner. Camilla and I are celebrating our engagement the same night. Come see what a real woman did for my career, something your flour-covered hands could never manage. Bring a pen. My lawyers will be at a private table in the back. We're finalizing the divorce tonight, and if you make a scene, I'll make sure you're buried in so much legal debt you'll be working in that kitchen until you drop dead. Dress appropriately, if you can afford it. Philip. I sank onto the edge of my faded sofa, the paper trembling in my hands. The sheer audacity of his cruelty took the breath from my lungs. Philip and I had met when we were 20. I was a girl with no family, raised in the St. Agnes home for children in Sussex, surviving on grit and a fierce independence. He was a charismatic, desperately ambitious student who promised me the world. Because I loved him. I believed him. When he wanted to go to a prestigious international relations program, I took on 3 jobs. I worked at a florist during the day, a bakery at dawn, and waitressed at a pub on weekends. I paid his tuition. I bought his tailored interview suits. I edited his essays while he slept. The moment he landed the junior executive role at Croft & Associates, everything shifted. He started coming home late, smelling of expensive scotch and a perfume that certainly didn't belong to me. Then came the gaslighting. He told me I was unrefined, that I didn't know how to speak to his new caliber of colleagues. He began hiding his finances, secretly draining our joint savings account to buy luxury watches and, as I would later discover, a 5-carat diamond ring. 6 months ago, he packed his bags while I was at work. He left a printed letter on the kitchen counter, stating he was moving in with Camilla Croft, his boss's daughter. He left me with thousands in credit card debt that he had fraudulently opened in my name. I had spent half a year eating ramen, dodging debt collectors, and crying myself to sleep, entirely broken by the man I had built. And now, he wanted me to witness his triumph. He wanted to parade his wealthy, connected new fiancée in front of me, and forced me to sign away the last 6 years of my life in a crowded ballroom, turning my heartbreak into a sideshow for his ego. A rational person would have thrown the invitation into the trash. A rational person would have hired a cutthroat lawyer and refused to play his game. But I didn't have the money for a lawyer, and more importantly, looking at that smug, vicious note ignited something deep within my chest. It wasn't sorrow anymore. It was rage, pure, unadulterated, blinding rage. For 6 years I had made myself small, so Philip could be big. I had swallowed my pride, hidden my exhaustion, and accepted his breadcrumbs of affection. He thought I was weak. He thought the girl from the orphanage would just roll over and accept her humiliation in the shadows. I stood up, the invitation falling to the floor. I walked into my tiny bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. There were dark circles under my hazel eyes, and my brown hair was tied in a messy, careless knot. I looked exhausted, but as I stared at my reflection, my jaw set. "I'm going," I whispered to the empty room. "I'm going to walk into that hotel. I'm going to sign his pathetic papers, and I am going to look him dead in the eye so he knows he didn't break me." I wasn't going to hide. If Philip wanted an audience, I would give him one. The next 3 days were a blur of nervous energy. The biggest hurdle was the dress code. Black tie/evening gown. My closet consisted entirely of sensible work trousers, oversized sweaters, and a few faded summer dresses. I couldn't afford to rent a designer gown, let alone buy one. On Thursday afternoon, I took the tube to Portobello Road. Tucked away in a quiet alley was a small vintage thrift shop I used to visit, just to window shop. The owner, a sweet older woman named Beatrice who always remembered my name, took one look at my determined but panicked face and asked, "What's the occasion, darling?" "I need to look like I belong in a room full of millionaires, Beatrice," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "And I have exactly 85 pounds to my name." Beatrice didn't blink. She locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and led me to the back of the shop. Money doesn't buy class, Genevieve. Vengeance, however, requires a very specific silhouette. We spent 2 hours digging through garment bags until she pulled out a masterpiece. It was a vintage, midnight blue velvet gown from the late 1980s. It had a severe, elegant boat neckline, long fitted sleeves, and a back that plunged low, draping perfectly to the floor. It was completely unadorned. No sequins, no lace, just the rich, heavy drape of the velvet. It fit me, as if it had been custom-tailored for my body. "It's striking," Beatrice murmured, adjusting the hem. "It makes you look like a weapon." I paid her my 85 pounds, leaving me with almost nothing for the week, but I didn't care. Saturday evening arrived with a heavy, oppressive stillness. The rain had stopped, leaving London cloaked in a damp, chilling fog. I spent 2 hours getting ready. I pulled my hair into a sleek, classic chignon at the nape of my neck. I applied my makeup with a steady hand, opting for a sharp, winged eyeliner and a deep, blood-red lipstick I hadn't worn in years. When I slipped into the midnight blue gown, I barely recognized the woman in the cracked floor-length mirror. She didn't look like a baker. She didn't look like a discarded wife. She looked regal, cold, untouchable. But there was one thing missing. My neckline was entirely bare, the expanse of pale skin demanding some kind of jewelry. I had pawned my thin, gold wedding band months ago to pay for electricity. I had no diamonds, no pearls. I walked over to the small, scuffed wooden box on my nightstand. Inside lay the only possession I truly cared about, the only thing I owned that predated Philip Pendleton. It was a heavy, antique gold locket. Sister Bernadette had given it to me on my 18th birthday, when I aged out of St. Agnes. She told me that when I was found on the orphanage steps, as an infant in the dead of winter, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. This locket had been tightly clutched in my tiny fist. and the police had investigated, but in 1999, without cameras or DNA databases, it was a dead end. I was a ghost. I picked it up, feeling its familiar, comforting weight in my palm. It wasn't delicate. It was substantial, almost masculine in its design. The gold was slightly tarnished, and the chain was thick, but the most distinguishing feature was the crest deeply engraved into the front. A rampant lion standing on its hind legs, its front paws holding a shattered sword, all beneath a highly detailed, sharp-pointed crown. I had spent countless hours in libraries as a teenager trying to identify the crest, poring over heraldry books, but I never found a match. It wasn't British. It wasn't French. It was an anomaly. The clasp was slightly broken so it couldn't be opened, and whatever was inside, if anything, remained a mystery. I had never worn it out in public. It felt too precious, too deeply connected to the gaping hole of my identity. But tonight, I needed armor. I needed a reminder that I existed before Philip, and I would exist long after him. I fastened the heavy gold chain around my neck. The locket rested perfectly in the center of my chest, stark and striking against the midnight blue velvet. It looked intentional. It looked like an heirloom. I grabbed my small black clutch, took a deep breath, and walked out the door. The taxi ride to the Savoy took 45 minutes, and with every mile, my heart hammered harder against my ribs. When the cab pulled up to the grand entrance, the street was lined with sleek black town cars and luxury vehicles. Flashes from paparazzi cameras popped near the entrance. Croft and Associates managed public relations for several minor European royals and high-ranking politicians, so their galas were always a media spectacle. I stepped out of the cab, the cool night air hitting my face. I ignored the whispers of the photographers, who clearly didn't recognize me but were intrigued by my complete lack of an entourage. I kept my chin high, my shoulders back, and walked through the revolving brass doors into the lion's den. The Lancaster Ballroom at the Savoy was a masterclass in overwhelming opulence. The ceiling was a canopy of glittering crystal chandeliers that threw fractured, blinding light across the room. Enormous floral arrangements of white orchids and dripping amaranth stood on every mahogany table. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos glided through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne and caviar blinis. The room was packed with London's elite, men in bespoke tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than my entire apartment building. Laughed softly, their voices blending into a low, wealthy hum. The air smelled thick with expensive Oud and Tom Ford perfumes. I stood at the top of the grand staircase overlooking the ballroom floor, taking it all in. My chest felt tight. A part of me, the girl who used to count pennies for bus fare, wanted to turn around and sprint back into the London fog. But then, my eyes locked onto him. Philip. He was standing near the center of the room, holding court. He looked incredibly handsome, dressed in a sharp Tom Ford tuxedo, his blonde hair perfectly coiffed. He was laughing, his head thrown back, holding a crystal tumbler of whiskey, and clinging to his arm was Camilla Croft. She was everything I was not. Tall, impossibly thin, with sleek, perfectly highlighted blonde hair. She was wearing a custom silver sequined gown that caught the light with every microscopic movement. She looked like a siren. She looked like old money. I took a breath, my fingers instinctively brushing the cold gold of my locket, and began my descent down the stairs. I didn't try to hide. I didn't stick to the shadows. I walked directly across the center of the ballroom, my midnight blue velvet parting the sea of guests. I noticed a few heads turn. I noticed the appreciative glances of a few older gentlemen and the calculating stares of the women. As I approached Philip's circle, his back was to me. "Philip," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chatter like a knife. He froze. Slowly, he turned around. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine shock register in his eyes. He scanned me from the top of my chignon, down the severe, elegant lines of the velvet gown, and back up to my face. For a moment, he looked entirely destabilized. I didn't look like the broken, exhausted woman he had left in Brixton, but Philip was a master of recovery. Within seconds, the shock morphed into a sneer of profound arrogance. "Well, well," Philip drawled, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding executives. "Look what the cat dragged in from the gutters of South London. I honestly didn't think you'd have the nerve to show your face, Genevieve." Camilla leaned into him, looking me up and down, with an expression of performative pity. "Oh, Philip, is this her? The starter wife?" She giggled, a sharp, grating sound. "You poor thing, did you rob a museum for that dusty old dress?" A few of Philip's colleagues chuckled nervously. "Be nice, Camilla," Philip said, his tone dripping with venom. "Jenny here has had a hard life. She's used to wearing cast-offs. I'm just glad she could make it to witness what true success looks like." He stepped closer to me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "You look pathetic, Genevieve, trying to play dress-up in a room where you don't even belong in the servants' quarters. My lawyer is in the Thames room down the hall. Go sign the papers, take the £5,000 I'm generously offering you, and crawl back to your bakery." My hands balled into fists at my sides, my nails digging into my palms to stop them from shaking. "I'm not signing anything until I see you squirm, Philip," I whispered back, my voice steady, despite the hurricane inside me. "You stole my money. You stole my credit. You are a fraud." Philip laughed loudly, stepping back. "A fraud? Darling, I'm about to be named senior partner of the most prestigious firm in Europe. I have the world in the palm of my hand." He gestured grandly to the room. "These people are royalty. Literally. They wouldn't spit on you if you were on fire." Before I could respond, a sharp, piercing chime echoed through the ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the room swung open, and the low hum of conversation instantly died out. The orchestra on the balcony stopped playing mid-note. Richard Croft, Philip's soon-to-be father-in-law, stepped up to the microphone on the grand stage. He was a silver-haired, imposing man with a booming voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "If I could have your attention, before we commence with the promotions and the evening's festivities, we have a profound honor. Croft and Associates has managed the diplomatic relations of many sovereign nations, but tonight we are graced by the presence of our most esteemed client. He has flown in privately from his kingdom to bless us with his presence." Philip puffed out his chest, leaning down to whisper to Camilla. "This is it, the big boss. He's going to personally congratulate me." "Please bow your heads and raise your glasses," Richard continued, his voice trembling slightly with reverence. "I present to you His Royal Majesty, King Leopold III of the sovereign state of Aldovia." The air in the room shifted entirely. A heavy, respectful silence fell as a contingent of towering security guards in sharp black suits entered the room, forming a perimeter. And then he walked in. King Leopold of Aldovia was a man who commanded a room without speaking a word. He was in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard peppered with gray and piercing, icy blue eyes. He wasn't wearing a crown. He was dressed in an immaculate military-style formal tuxedo adorned with several heavy medals and a deep red sash. He moved with a heavy, sorrowful grace, a man who carried the weight of a nation on his back. The entire ballroom bowed and curtsied in a massive, rippling wave. Even Philip and Camilla bent low. I, paralyzed by the sheer gravity of the moment and entirely unschooled in royal protocol, remained standing, staring at the monarch. King Leopold began to make his way through the crowd. Richard Croft scrambled down from the stage to guide him. The king nodded politely to the executives, shaking a few hands, his expression politely stoic. Philip practically vibrated with excitement. As the king approached our section of the floor, he stepped slightly in front of me, ensuring he was the center of attention, ready to deliver his practiced, sycophantic greeting. "Your Majesty," Philip said smoothly, bowing low again as King Leopold stopped a few feet away. "Philip Pendleton, it is the honor of a lifetime to welcome you." The king offered Philip a tight, courteous smile. "Mr. Pendleton, I have heard of your ambition." It wasn't exactly a compliment, but Philip beamed as if he had been knighted. "Thank you, sire. May I introduce my fiancée, Camilla Croft, and—" Philip cast a dismissive, cruel, backward glance at me. "An old acquaintance." King Leopold's icy blue eyes drifted past Philip's shoulder. They landed on me. I expected him to look away, to dismiss me with the same aristocratic indifference he showed the rest of the room, but he didn't. He stopped completely. The polite smile vanished from the king's face. His breath hitched audibly in the quiet room. His eyes, suddenly wide and terrified, snapped from my face down to my chest, down to the heavy antique gold locket resting against my midnight blue velvet dress, the rampant lion, the shattered sword, the pointed crown. King Leopold took a sudden, staggering step forward, bypassing Philip entirely. His security detail immediately tensed, moving to intercept, but the king threw his hand up, halting them with a violent, shaking gesture. He stood mere inches from me, ignoring the gasps of the surrounding crowd. He didn't look at Philip. He didn't look at Richard Croft. He looked only at the locket, his hands trembling violently as he slowly reached out. "Where?" The king's voice broke, a raw, devastated whisper that echoed in the dead-silent ballroom. "Where did you get that?" The silence in the Lancaster ballroom was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet. The kind that only exists when hundreds of people simultaneously hold their breath. The clinking of champagne flutes, the soft rustle of silk, the low hum of privilege, all of it had evaporated the moment King Leopold bypassed the man of the hour to stare at the tarnished gold resting against my collarbone. Philip's face was a mask of utter confusion. He stepped forward, a nervous, patronizing laugh escaping his lips. "Your Majesty, please forgive her. Genevieve is, and she's prone to wearing cheap trinkets. It's likely a knockoff from a flea market." "Silence!" The king's voice didn't just boom. It cracked like a whip across the ballroom. The sheer force of his command made Philip physically recoil, his face draining of color. Commander Sterling, the massive head of the king's security detail, immediately stepped forward, placing a heavy, gloved hand squarely on Philip's chest, physically shoving the soon-to-be senior partner back. King Leopold did not spare Philip another glance. His entire universe had narrowed down to the locket. His gloved fingers hovered over the gold, shaking so violently I thought he might collapse. "Please," the king whispered, his icy blue eyes rising to meet mine. They were swimming with unshed tears. The stern, untouchable monarch had vanished, replaced by a man looking at a ghost. "May I?" I was paralyzed. My throat felt like sandpaper. I could only manage a tiny, jerky nod. Leopold gently took the heavy gold pendant in his hands. He didn't just look at it. He held it like it was a sacred relic. "The clasp," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't place. "You've never opened it." "It's broken," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "Sister Bernadette, at the orphanage, she tried. The jeweler on High Street tried. It jammed shut." "It is not broken," King Leopold said, a tear finally escaping and tracking down his weathered cheek. "It is sealed. It was designed to only open to the touch of the one who forged it." With a practiced, desperate precision, the king pressed his thumb against the shattered sword on the crest. He didn't pull the clasp. Instead, he twisted the tiny pointed crown at the bottom of the crest counter-clockwise, then applied pressure to the lion's eye. There was a tiny, metallic click. The heavy gold locket, which had remained sealed for over 2 decades, sprang open in his hands. A collective gasp rippled through the front row of onlookers. I looked down, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. Inside the left panel was a miniature portrait, hand-painted on ivory. It was a picture of a woman. She had dark hair pulled into a sleek chignon, striking hazel eyes, and a sharp, elegant jawline. Looking at her was like looking into the cracked mirror in my Brixton flat. The resemblance wasn't just familial, it was uncanny. She wore a midnight blue gown. On the right panel, engraved deeply into the gold, were 3 words, "Our beloved Victoria." Beneath that was a date. November 12th, 1998, my exact birth date. The date Sister Bernadette had guessed when the police found me, based on my umbilical stump. The king let the locket drop gently back against my chest. He looked at me, his chest heaving, his hands reaching up to cup my face. His thumbs brushed my cheekbones. "You have her eyes," he choked out, his voice breaking completely. "You have Eleanor's eyes. I scoured the earth 25 years. They told me the carriage went into the river. They told me my wife and my infant daughter were washed away. We found Eleanor, but we never found you." The room began to spin. I was found on the steps of St. Agnes," I whispered, the words tumbling out of me like water from a broken dam. "In Sussex, in a wool blanket." "The nurse," Commander Sterling said suddenly, stepping up beside the king, his own eyes wide with shock. "Your Majesty, the head nurse disappeared the night of the assassination attempt. She must have fled with the princess. She must have smuggled her out of Aldovia to protect her. Victoria," King Leopold breathed, pulling me into a desperate, crushing embrace. "My Victoria, my daughter." I stood frozen in the arms of a king, the scent of cedar and old grief wrapping around me. For 25 years I had been an island. I had been an unwanted burden, a file in a Sussex police station, a baker's assistant, a discarded wife. And in a matter of seconds, the truth had rewritten my entire existence. I wasn't just Genevieve. I was Princess Victoria, Genevieve of Aldovia. A sharp, panicked voice sliced through the emotional heavy air. "This is insane," Philip shouted, his face flushed a violent, ugly red. He pushed past Richard Croft, ignoring the warning glare of the royal guards. "This is a scam. Your Majesty, you are being conned. I know this woman. She is a baker from South London. She is poor, she is uneducated, and she is a liar. She probably stole that necklace from a pawn shop just to ruin my night." King Leopold slowly pulled back from our embrace. The sorrow and overwhelming joy in his eyes instantly hardened into a sheet of glacial ice. He turned his head slowly to look at Philip. The temperature in the Lancaster ballroom seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. "A con," King Leopold repeated, his voice dangerously low. He released my shoulders and took a single imposing step toward Philip. The King of Aldovia was a tall man, broad and hardened by decades of ruling, and standing next to Philip's sleek, desperate frame, the difference in their power was palpable. Richard Croft rushed forward, sweating profusely, his expensive tuxedo suddenly looking far too tight. "Your Majesty, please, I apologize for my associate's outburst. Mr. Pendleton is simply shocked, as are we all. We had no idea." "Quiet, Richard," the king snapped without looking at him. Richard immediately clamped his mouth shut, retreating a step. Leopold kept his icy gaze locked on Philip. "You claimed you know this woman. You called her, what was it, an old acquaintance?" Philip swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The bravado he had wielded so effortlessly just 10 minutes ago was rapidly crumbling. She She was my wife, Your Majesty. We are estranged. She's a bitter, vindictive woman who came here to cause a scene because I am marrying Camilla." He gestured frantically to the blonde woman beside him, who was currently staring at me with wide, horrified eyes. King Leopold turned back to me. His expression softened infinitesimally. "Is this true, Victoria? Were you married to this, creature?" I stood a little taller. The weight of the heavy velvet dress and the newly opened locket felt different now. It didn't feel like a costume. It felt like armor. "His name is Philip Pendleton," I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I worked 3 jobs for 6 years to pay for his university and his master's degree. I supported him until he got his position at Croft and Associates. 6 months ago, he drained our joint bank accounts, took out fraudulent credit cards in my name, and abandoned me to move in with his boss's daughter. A collective, horrified murmur ran through the crowd of London elite. A few of the older diplomats cast disgusted glances at Philip. Philip's face twisted in panic. "Lies! She's hysterical. I earned everything I have." "He invited me here tonight," I continued, reaching into my small black clutch. I pulled out the heavy cream envelope and the handwritten note attached to the silver paperclip. I held it out to the king. "He told me to come watch him celebrate his promotion and his new engagement. He told me his lawyers were in the back room, waiting to force me into a divorce that would leave me with nothing. He wanted me here so he could humiliate me." Commander Sterling took the note from my hand and passed it to the king. Leopold read Philip's vicious, scribbled words. With every second that passed, the king's jaw clenched tighter. The silence was deafening. When Leopold finally looked up, his eyes were devoid of any mercy. "Mr. Croft," the king said, his voice deadly calm. Richard Croft practically tripped over his own feet, rushing back to the king's side. "Yes, Your Majesty. Croft and Associates currently manages the Sovereign Wealth Fund and the diplomatic communications for the state of Aldovia, do they not?" Richard dabbed his sweating forehead with a silk handkerchief. "Yes, sire. It is our greatest privilege." "That contract is worth what? £40 million annually?" "Approximately, yes, Your Majesty. If Philip Pendleton is still employed by your firm in 60 seconds, King Leopold stated, his voice ringing with absolute unyielding authority, "Aldovia will withdraw every single asset. I will personally ensure that every royal house in Europe severs ties with Croft and Associates by tomorrow morning. I will bankrupt your firm, Richard." Richard Croft let out a strangled gasp. He spun around, his face purple with rage, and pointed a trembling finger at Philip. "You're done, Pendleton. You are fired. Get out of my sight. Security, remove him from the premises instantly." Philip looked like he had been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. Richard, you can't be serious. I'm making senior partner. Camilla and I are getting married." He turned desperately to the blonde woman in the silver sequined gown. "Camilla, tell him. Tell your father." Camilla Croft looked at Philip, then looked at the furious king, and finally looked at me, the newly discovered princess of a sovereign nation. Camilla was arrogant, but she wasn't stupid. She knew exactly which way the wind was blowing. She took a slow, deliberate step away from Philip. She reached onto her left hand, pulled the 5-carat diamond ring, the ring Philip had bought with my stolen credit, off her finger and dropped it onto the polished mahogany table beside her. It landed with a heavy final clink. "Don't speak to me, Philip," Camilla said coldly, lifting her chin. "The engagement is off. You are an absolute embarrassment." Philip staggered back as if she had slapped him. His entire world, his promotion, his wealth, his trophy fiancé, his carefully curated facade of superiority, had been incinerated in less than 5 minutes. "You stole from my daughter," King Leopold said, stepping closer to Philip. forcing the disgraced man to cower beneath him. You emotionally tortured a princess of the blood. You thought she had no family to protect her. You were gravely mistaken. The king snapped his fingers. Commander Sterling. Sire, contact our legal attachés at the embassy, Leopold commanded. I want a full forensic audit of Mr. Pendleton's finances. I want every penny he stole from my daughter returned with interest. If he has committed fraud, I want him prosecuted to the absolute maximum extent of British law. Leave him with nothing. It will be done immediately, Your Majesty, Sterling replied with a terrifyingly polite smile. Two burly Savoy security guards flanked Philip, grabbing him roughly by the arms. Philip didn't even fight them. He looked completely hollowed out, a pathetic, broken shell of the arrogant man who had stood laughing in the center of the room just moments before. As they dragged him toward the service elevator in the back, his eyes met mine one last time. There was no rage left in them, only the dawning realization of his absolute ruin. King Leopold turned his back on the pathetic scene and looked at me. The harshness vanished from his face, replaced once again by profound, overwhelming love. He offered me his arm. I believe we have much catching up to do, Victoria, he said softly. My private jet is waiting at Heathrow. It's time to go home. I looked around the Lancaster ballroom. The elite of London, the people Philip had begged to be accepted by, were completely silent, watching us with awe and reverence. I smiled, slipping my arm through my father's. I'd like that very much. The interior of the Aldovian Royal Boeing 747 was less of an airplane and more of a flying five-star hotel suite. The walls were paneled in rich cherry wood. The seats were upholstered in buttery cream leather, and a crystal chandelier hung securely over a polished dining table. Just 12 hours ago, I had been scraping pennies together to afford a damp, drafty flat in Brixton. Now, I was drinking vintage chamomile tea from a porcelain cup that likely cost more than my entire vintage wardrobe. I sat across from King Leopold, my father. Fuff, the word still felt foreign, a strange, heavy syllable on my tongue. He had spent the first 3 hours of the flight telling me everything about Queen Eleanor. She had been fiercely intelligent, an Oxford-educated historian who had captured the king's heart with her sharp wit and refusal to yield to archaic royal protocols. She hated the heavy ceremonial gowns, Leopold said, a fond, wistful smile crinkling the corners of his icy blue eyes. She used to sneak out of the palace gardens in denim trousers to buy pastries from the local markets. When I look at you, Victoria, the resemblance is staggering, not just your face, but the fire in your eyes when you stood up to that wretched boy in the ballroom. Eleanor would have been so intensely proud of you. I traced the ream of my teacup, the heavy gold locket resting warmly against my chest. If she was so loved, why did it happen? Who would want to hurt her and a baby? Leopold's smile vanished, replaced by a dark, weathered sorrow. He leaned back against his leather seat, the cabin lights casting long shadows across his face. Aldovia is a wealthy nation, Victoria. Our natural resources and strategic alliances make us a jewel in Europe. But wealth breeds ambition, and ambition breeds venom, he explained quietly. 25 years ago, I was pushing for a massive democratic reform that would strip the extended royal cousins of their tax-exempt statuses and redirect the crown's wealth into public infrastructure. My cousin, Duke Frederick, was vehemently opposed. He was and still is the loudest voice of the traditionalist faction. Leopold sighed, running a hand over his graying beard. The night of the accident, Eleanor and I were supposed to travel together to the summer estate. I was delayed by an emergency parliamentary session. Eleanor went ahead with you and your head nurse, Margaret. Their motorcade was run off a treacherous cliff road into the River Elbe. The official report cited a blown tire and a severe storm. But you never believed it, I murmured. No, I didn't, he said, his voice hardening into steel. "We recovered the vehicle. We recovered Eleanor. But Margaret and you were gone. For years I ripped the country apart looking for you. It wasn't until a decade later that Margaret's remains were found in a shallow grave near the French border. Eating, she had been shot. She didn't drown. She had taken you and run for her life, trying to smuggle you out of the country before the assassins could finish the job. She must have left you at the orphanage in Sussex to keep you hidden before they caught up with her." A cold shiver raced down my spine. The woman who had saved my life had died entirely alone, terrified, protecting a child that wasn't hers. I vowed right then and there that I would find out exactly who pulled that trigger. When the jet finally touched down in the capital city of Oakhaven, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of violet and gold. The royal motorcade whisked us through pristine, cobblestone streets toward the Aldovian Royal Palace, a sprawling, magnificent fortress of white stone and dark iron gates perched on a hill overlooking the sea. As we walked through the grand entrance hall, flanked by bowing servants and ancient tapestries, a man stepped out from the shadows of the marble colonnade. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, and held a silver-tipped walking cane. His silver hair was slicked back, and his eyes, a muddy, pale brown, were fixed on me with a terrifyingly calm intensity. "Leopold," the man said, his voice smooth like oiled glass. "When Commander Sterling wired ahead that you were returning early from London, I was surprised. When he said you were bringing a guest, I was intrigued." "Oh, she is not a guest, Frederick," Leopold said, stepping slightly in front of me, his posture instantly rigid. "This is Victoria, my daughter, the true heir to the Aldovian throne." Duke Frederick stopped dead in his tracks. For 25 years since my supposed death, Frederick had been the heir presumptive. He had spent a quarter of a century waiting for Leopold to pass, measuring the throne for himself. Now, standing before him in a velvet thrift store dress was the total annihilation of his life's work. Frederick's eyes darted to the locket on my chest. A microscopic muscle feathered in his jaw, but his recovery was unnervingly fast. He plastered on a wide, practiced smile and bowed gracefully. "A miracle," Frederick breathed, though his eyes remained dead. "A true, profound miracle. The entire nation will weep with joy. Welcome home, Your Royal Highness." "Thank you, Duke Frederick," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. I had spent 6 years reading the subtle, manipulative shifts in Philip's behavior. I knew exactly what a cornered snake looked like. Frederick wasn't weeping with joy. He was calculating how to destroy me. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of royal physicians, DNA tests, and grueling lessons in Aldovian history and protocol. The DNA results had returned within 48 hours, confirming what the king's heart already knew. I was a 99.9% match. I was Princess Victoria. The palace was beautiful, but it felt like a gilded cage. I spent my afternoons in the royal archives, a habit born from my years of researching and editing Philip's complex international relations papers. I had asked Commander Sterling to quietly pull the financial ledgers of the royal estate from the year of my mother's death. If an assassination had been paid for, the money had to come from somewhere. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 month after the gala in London, King Leopold convened the High Royal Council. It was to be my official, legal recognition as the Crown Princess, a formality required to formally displace Duke Frederick from the line of succession. The council chamber was a cavernous, circular room lined with dark oak and towering stained glass windows. 20 of Aldovia's highest-ranking ministers and lords sat around a massive, circular table. I sat at my father's right hand, dressed in a custom-tailored emerald green suit, my hair styled perfectly, the locket gleaming against my collar. "My lords," King Leopold began, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "The medical and historical evidence is irrefutable. Today we officially amend the line of succession. Princess Victoria Genevieve is the sole and rightful heir to the Aldovian throne." A murmur of assent rippled through the ministers. Pens were lifted to sign the heavy parchment document resting in the center of the table. "Your Majesty, if I may," a smooth, oily voice interrupted. Duke Frederick stood from his seat across the table. He looked entirely too calm. He leaned heavily on his silver-tipped cane, a sorrowful expression plastered on his face. "I, more than anyone, wish for this fairy tale to be true. I have mourned sweet Eleanor and little Victoria for decades. However, the integrity of the crown must be absolute." "The DNA is absolute, Frederick," Leopold growled, his patience snapping. "DNA can be tampered with, sire," Frederick countered smoothly, "especially when the medical staff is heavily influenced by a monarch desperate for a miracle. And as for the locket, well, masterful forgeries exist." "Watch your tongue, Frederick," Commander Sterling warned from his post by the door, his hand resting near his sidearm. "I am merely doing my duty to Aldovia," Frederick insisted, raising his hands in mock surrender. "And it is my duty to bring forth evidence of a deeply disturbing nature. I have found an independent witness, someone who knows this young woman intimately, someone who can testify to her long history of manipulation and fraud." My stomach performed a sickening flip. I knew exactly what was happening before the heavy oak doors even opened. The guards pulled the doors wide, and a man walked into the council chamber. He looked vastly different from the polished, arrogant executive I had seen at the Savoy. His face was gaunt, his eyes were manic and bloodshot, and his suit hung loosely on his frame. It was Philip. "Philip Pendleton," Frederick announced to the bewildered council. "The woman's former husband, a respectable British consultant. He is a thief and a fraud," King Leopold roared, slamming his fist onto the oak table, half rising from his chair. "Guards, remove this filth from the palace instantly." "Wait," Philip shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He held up a thick manila folder. "Your Majesty, please. You are being played. Genevieve is a master con artist." "Let him speak, sire." Lord Chancellor Davies, an elderly, respected minister, interjected cautiously. "If there is an accusation, the council must hear it to clear the princess's name completely." Leopold looked like he wanted to execute Philip on the spot. But he slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He gave a sharp nod. Philip smirked, a flash of his old, vicious arrogance returning now that he had an audience. He walked toward the center of the room. I knew exactly why he was here. Following the gala, King Leopold's legal team had decimated Philip. His bank accounts were frozen. He was facing 5 years in a British prison for identity theft and wire fraud, and he was completely destitute. Duke Frederick must have found him, paid his bail, and offered him a massive fortune to come here and torch my legitimacy. "My lords," Philip began, putting on his best, most persuasive corporate voice. "I was married to this woman for 6 years. I know her better than anyone. She has always been obsessed with wealth and status. 6 months ago, I discovered she had commissioned a dark web jeweler to forge that very locket, based on old Aldovian historical texts she found in my university library." Gasps echoed around the table. "It's a lie," I said calmly, not raising my voice. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, fixing Philip with a dead, icy stare. "You know it's a lie, Philip." "Is it?" Philip sneered. He opened the folder and threw several glossy photographs onto the table. "These are bank statements. Genevieve secretly funneled thousands of pounds from my accounts to pay for the forgery. When I caught her and demanded a divorce, She swore she would destroy me. She stalked me to the Savoy, played on the king's grief, and executed the greatest con in modern history. Duke Frederick looked thoroughly triumphant. You see, my lords, this woman is a bitter, impoverished ex-wife who used stolen funds to orchestrate a coup. She is no princess. The council erupted into chaos. Ministers were shouting, demanding the DNA be retested by international laboratories. King Leopold was fiercely defending me, but the seed of doubt, Frederick's true weapon, had been successfully planted. I let the chaos rage for a full minute. I watched Philip puff out his chest, victorious. I watched Frederick hide his smirk behind a coughing fit. Then I reached into the leather briefcase at my feet and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. I dropped it onto the center of the oak table. It landed with a heavy, concussive thud that instantly silenced the room. "I'm so glad you brought up financial fraud, Philip," I said, my voice echoing in the sudden quiet. I stood up, smoothing the front of my emerald jacket. "Because as you well know, for 6 years, I was the one who did your taxes. I was the one who balanced your books. I have a photographic memory for numbers. It's how I kept us from starving while you were buying 5-carat diamonds on my credit." Philip's smirk faltered. "What is she talking about?" he muttered to Frederick. I ignored him, turning my attention to the High Council. "My lords, over the past 3 weeks, I haven't just been learning how to curtsy. I have been reviewing the private financial ledgers of the Aldovian royal estate from 25 years ago. Specifically, the discretionary funds managed by the heir presumptive." Duke Frederick's face instantly drained of all color. He gripped his silver cane so hard his knuckles turned white. "Stop her," Frederick snapped, his voice losing its smooth veneer. "This is a distraction. She is changing the subject." "I found a discrepancy," I continued loudly, locking eyes with Frederick. "Exactly 2 days before my mother's motorcade was run off the cliff, a sum of 2 million euros was wired from Duke Frederick's private holding company in Switzerland to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account belonging to a man named Viktor Zhukov, a notorious mercenary who was killed in a shootout with French police 10 years ago, right near the border where my nurse, Margaret, was found buried. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and lethal. "That is a coincidence," Frederick shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "An investment. You have no proof of what that money was for." "I didn't," I said, turning back to Philip, who now looked entirely terrified. "Until you walked into this room, Philip. You see, when a man is as desperate and broke as you are, he leaves a trail." I opened the folder I had brought with me and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the table to Lord Chancellor Davies. "Lord Chancellor, that is a wire transfer intercept obtained by Commander Sterling's Cyber Division 12 hours ago. It shows a deposit of £500,000 into a newly opened shell account in Philip Pendleton's name." I paused, letting the tension stretch until it was ready to snap. "The origin account for that bribe, my lords, is the exact same Swiss holding company Duke Frederick used 25 years ago." I looked at Frederick, who was now trembling violently, and then down at Philip, who was backing away toward the door. "You didn't just hire a liar, Frederick," I said softly, the weight of the crown settling firmly onto my shoulders. "You hired an amateur." The Lord Chancellor, his hands trembling slightly, adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles and scrutinized the wire transfer documents I had slid across the heavy oak table. The silence in the council chamber was no longer just heavy. It was suffocating, thick, with the sudden, undeniable stench of treason. "The routing numbers match, Your Majesty," Chancellor Davies whispered, the color completely draining from his weathered face. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Duke Frederick with a mixture of profound disgust and sheer horror. "The shell company that wired the funds to Mr. Pendleton. It is the exact same account that paid Viktor Zhukov 25 years ago. Oh, it is a frame job, Duke Frederick roared, slamming his silver-tipped cane against the marble floor. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, making several ministers flinch. His carefully maintained veneer of aristocratic sorrow had completely shattered, revealing the desperate, feral monster underneath. This peasant girl is colluding with foreign cyber-terrorists to forge bank records. I am the Duke of Oakhaven. I am the heir presumptive. You cannot condemn me on the word of a baker and, a fabricated piece of paper. It is not just a piece of paper, Frederick, King Leopold said. His voice was terrifyingly soft, the deadly calm of a hurricane's eye. He rose slowly from his throne at the head of the table. Our cyber division has penetrated your private servers in Geneva. We have the digital footprint. We have the encrypted emails you sent to Zhukov. We have the timeline of how you orchestrated the murder of my wife and how you tried to murder my infant daughter, simply because you could not stomach losing your grip on the national treasury. Frederick took a staggering step backward. His pale, muddy brown eyes darted toward the heavy oak doors, calculating a route of escape. But Commander Sterling and 4 heavily armed royal guards were already blocking the exit, their hands resting ominously on their holstered weapons. Realizing he was trapped, Frederick spun violently toward Philip. "Tell them," he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at my ex-husband. "Tell them she forced you. Tell them the money was a settlement for the divorce. If you do not speak right now, you pathetic little British rat, I will personally ensure you never see the light of day." But Philip Pendleton was not a hardened criminal mastermind. He was a cowardly opportunist who had spent his entire life bullying people who were smaller and poorer than him. Now, surrounded by armed guards, furious lords, and a monarch ready to execute him, Philip's fragile ego completely collapsed. I didn't know," Philip practically sobbed, his knees buckling as he collapsed against the edge of the council table. He held his hands up in surrender, tears of pure terror streaming down his face. "He paid me. I swear to God, Your Majesty, I didn't know about the assassination. I didn't know about the Queen. The Duke's fixers approached me when I was bailing out of London. They offered me £500,000 to come here and say the locket was a fake. I just needed the money." "Shut your mouth, you sniveling coward," Frederick bellowed, lunging forward with his cane raised, aiming directly for Philip's head. Before the silver tip could connect, Commander Sterling moved with terrifying speed. He intercepted the strike, grabbing the cane and twisting it violently out of Frederick's grasp. In the same fluid motion, Sterling kicked the back of the Duke's knees, sending the man who had plotted to steal a kingdom crashing to the marble floor. 2 guards immediately descended on him, pinning his arms behind his back and slapping heavy steel cuffs onto his wrists. "Philip," I said, my voice cutting through the shouting and the scuffle. Philip looked up at me from the floor, his face red and splotchy, his expensive suit ruined. He looked utterly pathetic. "Jenny," he pleaded, crawling a few inches toward me. "Jenny, please. You know me, I'm greedy, yes, but I'm not a murderer. I wouldn't hurt a queen. We were married, we loved each other. Tell them to let me go. I'll sign the divorce papers. I'll give you whatever you want." I looked down at the man who had gaslit me, stolen from me, and invited me to a gala specifically to mock my poverty. I felt no anger anymore, only a deep, profound pity. "You don't have anything I want, Philip," I said coldly, stepping away from him. "And my name is Victoria. Take him away." "No, Jenny, please, you owe me. I made you." Philip screamed as the guards hoisted him to his feet, dragging him backward toward the doors. His fingernails scraped uselessly against the heavy oak table. "I'm a British citizen. You can't do this. Richard Croft will hear about this. Richard Croft's firm is filing for bankruptcy as we speak," King Leopold stated, not even bothering to look at Philip as he was dragged away. "And under Aldovian law, conspiracy to dethrone the rightful heir is an act of high treason. You will not be seeing Britain for a very, very long time, Mr. Pendleton." The heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off Philip's frantic, sobbing pleas. Duke Frederick was hauled to his feet. He had a bloody lip from where his face had struck the floor, and his silver hair was in wild disarray. He glared at King Leopold, a sneer twisting his face. "You think you've won, Leopold?" Frederick hissed, blood staining his teeth. "You are handing the legacy of a 1,000-year-old dynasty to a street rat who smells like yeast and cheap thrift stores. She will destroy this country." King Leopold walked right up to his treacherous cousin. He didn't yell. He didn't strike him. He simply leaned in and spoke with the absolute authority of a man who had finally avenged his greatest heartbreak. "She has more strength, more grace, and more intelligence in her little finger than you have demonstrated in your entire miserable existence, Frederick. You murdered my wife. You stole 25 years of my daughter's life. You are hereby stripped of all titles, all lands, and all wealth. You will be taken to the Blackwater Penitentiary, and you will be forgotten." Frederick opened his mouth to spit a final curse, but Sterling shoved him forward, marching the disgraced Duke out of the council chamber. When the doors closed for the final time, the room descended into a heavy, reverent silence. The minister slowly turned to look at me. I was still standing perfectly straight, the heavy emerald fabric of my jacket unwrinkled, my breath steady. King Leopold turned to me. The harsh, militant ruler vanished, and suddenly he was just a father who had carried a crushing burden for a quarter of a century. He reached out, his large calloused hand gently touching my shoulder. His eyes were wet. "It's over," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Eleanor is finally at peace, and you, my brilliant, beautiful girl, you brought the truth to the light." I reached up, my fingers brushing against the heavy gold locket that had started it all. The lion, the shattered sword, the pointed crown. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry anymore. It was the key to my past and the foundation of my future. "No, father," I replied softly, offering him a resolute smile. We brought it to the light, together. 6 months later, the spring sun was shining brilliantly over the coastal capital of Oak Haven. The sea sparkled like crushed diamonds, and the streets were lined with millions of cheering citizens, waving the royal blue and silver flags of Aldovia. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the royal dressing room. I was no longer wearing vintage velvet from Portobello Road. I was draped in a breathtaking custom-made gown of midnight blue silk, a subtle homage to the dress I had worn the night my life changed. The bodice was embroidered with real silver thread, detailing the Aldovian crest. Behind me, 2 attendants were carefully pinning a sweeping, velvet cape to my shoulders. "You look breathtaking, Your Royal Highness," whispered Lady Beatrice. I had tracked down the sweet thrift store owner in London, bought her a first-class ticket, and offered her the position of my head of wardrobe. She had accepted before I even finished the sentence. "Thank you, Beatrice," I smiled, turning side to side. A lot had changed in 6 months. The trial of Duke Frederick had been swift and merciless. The evidence I had compiled from the ledgers, combined with Philip's cowardly, full immunity confession regarding the cover-up, resulted in Frederick receiving a life sentence in absolute solitary confinement at Blackwater. Philip's attempt to save himself had only partially worked. While he wasn't executed for treason, he was found guilty of massive financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy against the crown. He was sentenced to 15 years in a high-security Aldovian prison. I heard through the diplomatic grapevine that he spent his days doing hard laundry labor, scrubbing sheets until his soft, manicured hands bled. As for Camilla Croft, her fall from grace was spectacular. Without the Aldovian Sovereign Wealth Fund, Croft and Associates hemorrhaged clients and imploded under a mountain of debt and scandal. The London elite, terrified of King Leopold's wrath, blacklisted the entire family. Last I heard, Camilla was working as an assistant manager at a discount shoe store in a dismal strip mall outside of Leeds. A gentle knock echoed through the room, and my father entered. King Leopold looked 10 years younger. The heavy, dark circles under his eyes had vanished, replaced by a warm, vibrant energy. He was dressed in his full ceremonial uniform. In his hands he carried a velvet cushion. Resting on top of it was a delicate, glittering diamond tiara. "Are you ready, Victoria?" he asked, his voice thick with pride. I turned fully to face him. I reached up and touched my neck. Resting right at my collarbone, polished and gleaming, was the heavy gold locket. The jeweler had offered to fix the clasp seamlessly, but I had refused. I wanted the tiny scratch near the crown to remain, a reminder that things can be broken, sealed away in the dark, and still hold immense, undeniable worth. "I am, Father," I said, my voice steady and clear. He stepped forward and gently placed the tiara on my head. He kissed my forehead, offered me his arm, and together we walked out of the dressing room, down the grand marble corridors, and out onto the massive balcony of the royal palace. The moment we stepped into the sunlight, a roar erupted from the millions of people gathered in the square below. It was a sound so massive it vibrated in my chest. Trumpets blared, and a squadron of jets screamed overhead, leaving trails of blue and silver smoke in the sky. I looked out over the sea of faces. I thought about the drafty flat in Brixton. I thought about the smell of flour at 4 a.m. I thought about the cruel note Philip had sent me, inviting me to witness his triumph. He had wanted to break me. He had wanted me to feel utterly worthless. Instead, he had handed me a kingdom. I raised my hand, waving to my people, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across my face as the crowd chanted my name. I was Princess Victoria Genevieve. I had survived the shadows, and now I was ready to rule the light. Karma is not just a concept. Dotihi, sometimes it is an absolute force of nature. Genevieve spent years in the shadows, sacrificing her own well-being for a man who repaid her with nothing but cruelty and betrayal. Philip thought his wealth and status made him invincible, but he forgot one crucial rule: you can never truly destroy someone who has learned how to build themselves from nothing. In his arrogant attempt to mock his discarded wife, he unknowingly handed her the keys to a kingdom, orchestrating his own spectacular downfall. True royalty isn't just about bloodlines. It's about the resilience, grace, and unbreakable spirit you forge in your darkest hours. If this story of ultimate revenge, hidden royalty, and fierce justice kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this incredible journey with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, real-life twists and storytelling that proves the truth is always wilder than fiction.